At my daughter's wedding, her arrogant fiancé grabbed the back of my neck and smashed my face into the four-tier wedding cake. He laughed into the microphone and said, "Try some dessert, beggar. Let us not have people saying I let my father-in-law starve." The crowd gasped, but before I even wiped the frosting from my eyes, the most ruthless real estate tycoon on the East Coast jumped from the VIP table, pointed a shaking finger at him, and shouted, "Are you out of your mind? He is a billionaire." The fiancé, drained of all color, went pale as a ghost. What he had no idea about was that just 3 hours earlier, I had quietly bought out every single dime of his massive secret debt. I eased back on the heavy manual transmission of my rusted 2003 Chevy Silverado. The old engine let out its familiar comforting groan as I worked my way along the steep, perfectly manicured, winding driveway leading up to a lavish Kiowa Island estate. The hands locked around that worn steering wheel were thick-weathered and heavily calloused, the hands of a man who had devoted 40 years to assembling a global shipping and commercial real estate empire, beginning with absolutely nothing but a single rusty tugboat on the freezing docks of Charleston. I did not inherit my wealth. I bled for every dollar of it. I gave up my youth, my sleep, and in the end, my marriage, all to construct a fortress of security around my family. And still, I never once felt the urge to flaunt what I had built. I kept driving my old truck. No chauffeur, no luxury sedan, no statement to make. Just me and that battered Silverado rolling up a driveway that could have swallowed my first apartment whole. That was always my way. Let the ledger speak, never the lifestyle. 40 years of discipline had taught me that the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we go any further, drop a quick comment and let me know what time of day it is, where you are, morning coffee, afternoon break, or burning the midnight oil. I'd genuinely love to know. Now a brief note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the audio experience, and any resemblance to real people or situations is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. I still polish my own boots. Resting on the cracked leather of the passenger seat beside me was the wedding invitation. Heavy stock, excessively expensive, raised gold foil lettering pressed into every word. An invitation to the wedding of my only child, my daughter Sloane. We had been deeply estranged for the past 15 years, ever since the bitter collapse of my marriage to her mother, Claudia. Claudia was a woman who loved the idea of wealth and high society far more than she ever loved the man grinding day and night to provide it. When we split, she poisoned Sloane's mind against me, painting me as a work-obsessed mechanic who cared more about cargo ships than his own family. Tucked inside that elegant, shimmering envelope was a small yellow sticky note, not a message of love or excitement from my daughter, but a hastily scribbled line from Claudia. It read, "Try to look decent, Garrett. Stand in the back." I left my beaten-up truck at the far edge of the parking area, deliberately tucking it out of sight in the shadows between gleaming Porsches, imported Mercedes, and chauffeur-driven luxury SUVs. I switched off the engine and let the silence settle over me for a moment. I stepped out, drew a slow breath of salty ocean air, and smoothed down the lapels of my suit. It was a clean, well-pressed navy suit from JCPenney that I had bought 15 years ago. My boots were old steel-toed work boots. I had polished them until they gleamed, but they were still deeply scuffed at the toes from years of walking cargo ship decks. They were comfortable, and more importantly, they grounded me, a constant reminder of exactly who I was and where I had come from. I walked at an unhurried pace toward the grand, towering entrance of the estate. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts darted frantically to hold doors for women draped in designer gowns and men strutting in tailored tuxedos. The wealth on display was almost deafening, but to a man who truly has money, that kind of loud, desperate flaunting always reads as pure performance. As I climbed the sweeping stone steps, a younger man moved directly into my path, cutting me off completely. He was impeccably turned out in a custom-fitted navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. His hair was slicked back perfectly, and his posture radiated the particular arrogance of someone who had never truly earned what he had. This was Drake Fontaine, the man my daughter was about to marry. I had never formally been introduced to him, thanks to Claudia keeping me entirely cut off from Sloane's adult life, but I recognized his face from the handful of photographs I had come across online. Drake stopped and looked me over from head to toe. His eyes swept across my outdated suit and dropped straight down to my scuffed work boots. A look of profound disgust crossed his face as though I had tracked mud through the door of his personal kingdom. He sneered, releasing a short, dismissive sigh. Without a single word of greeting or the most basic human decency, he reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a set of keys hanging from a heavy leather fob, and thrust them hard against my chest. "Here, take the keys to my car," he said, his voice soaked in condescension. "And be careful with the clutch. It is worth more than your life. Park it near the front so my guests can admire it." I did not reach for the keys. I kept my hands resting quietly at my sides. I stood perfectly still, posture straight, and held his gaze. I let the silence stretch between us long enough to watch irritation crawl across his polished face, as it became clear I had no intention of obeying. "I am not the valet," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and steady, carrying the full weight of a man who has spent decades negotiating with ruthless union bosses and international tycoons. "My name is Garrett Weston. I am Sloane's father." The keys slipped from his outstretched fingers and clattered onto the stone driveway. For just a split second, the arrogant smirk vanished entirely from Drake's face. He blinked, visibly caught off guard, staring at me the way a man stares at an unwanted stray that has somehow wandered into a palace. But the shock didn't hold long. Within moments, his practiced smile was back tight, forced entirely hollow. "Right," he chuckled nervously, crouching quickly to snatch his keys off the cold stone. "Sloane mentioned you might actually show up. I just didn't expect you to look so authentic." He did not offer his hand. He didn't bother saying it was a pleasure to meet the man who raised his future bride. Instead, he turned and snapped his fingers sharply at a security guard posted near the heavy wooden doors. The guard jogged over immediately, expression taut. "Keep a close eye on the old man," Drake ordered, not even troubling himself to lower his voice. "Make sure he doesn't drift into the VIP lounge or start pestering the catering staff for free food. We have serious, very wealthy investors arriving shortly, and I won't have any embarrassing distractions." The security guard nodded and shot me a wary, almost apologetic look. Drake turned his back on me without another word and crossed to a cluster of well-heeled guests, laughing loudly and clapping them on the shoulders as though I had already ceased to exist. I stood there on those steps, the cold ocean breeze pressing against my face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I simply watched him walk away. That single brief exchange told me everything I needed to know. A man who greets a stranger with that depth of contempt, purely on the assumption that they have no money, is a man concealing something very dark and very fragile behind his expensive clothes. I slid my hand into my pocket and felt the smooth casing of my encrypted satellite phone. The weekend had barely started, and Drake Fontaine had already made the gravest miscalculation of his life. The game was in motion. The grand dining hall of the estate was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. Crystal chandeliers poured warm light over tables draped in imported silk. Towering floral centerpieces loomed above the seated guests, heavy with rare orchids that cost more than a modest family's monthly grocery bill. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, laying a sophisticated soundtrack beneath the clinking of champagne flutes and the boastful laughter of the coastal elite. It was the hollow theatrical spectacle of wealth that Claudia had always craved. I located my assigned seat. It was a small, unsteady chair wedged into the furthest corner of the cavernous room, positioned directly beside the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. Every few minutes, a waiter burst through trailing a blast of hot air and the chaotic clatter of crashing dishes. I had been placed as far from Sloane and the main wedding party as the room would allow, deliberately kept in the shadows meant to go unseen. It was a calculated insult engineered to make me feel profoundly unwelcome. I pulled out my chair and sat quietly, resting my calloused hands on my knees. I said nothing to the staff. A man who genuinely knows his own worth never needs to fight for a seat at the center of the room. I watched the elite guests work the room around me. To them, I was just an old man in an outdated suit with scuffed boots and unfortunate smudge on an otherwise flawless canvas. Then Drake's family made their grand entrance. They took their places at the head tables, but not before swinging deliberately past my dark corner first. Drake's mother, draped in ostentatious jewelry, glanced down at my boots and let out a sharp, audible gasp. She leaned toward her sister and whispered loudly enough to ensure I heard every syllable. "Can you believe he wore those hideous work boots to a formal dinner? It is absolutely disgraceful. Drake is kind to even allow that riffraff inside the building." They talked about me as though I were deaf, or simply too beneath them to register their cruelty. A familiar steady calm settled over me. In 40 years of building a global logistics empire from nothing, I had stared down ruthless international cartel bosses and come out the other side. The petty snickering of these sheltered socialites registered as barely a whisper. I took a slow sip of water. Fools always laugh the loudest right before the ground gives way beneath them. My ex-wife Claudia made her way across the room in a sleek designer gown, her face arranged in a polished smile. But the moment she reached my table, that smile evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened glare. She stopped beside my chair spine, rigid with years of old resentment. "I told you to stand in the back, Garrett," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "But you just had to come inside and ruin the aesthetic. You look like a homeless person who wandered in off the street." I started to reply. "I am only here for my daughter." Before I could get a word out, she reached into her expensive silver clutch and produced a crisp-folded $100 bill. With a sharp, aggressive motion, she forced the money into the front breast pocket of my old JCPenney suit. She patted the pocket twice, a condescending little gesture that made my jaw go tight. "Take that money," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "Use it for gas on the way back to whatever trailer park you're living in these days. Leave first thing tomorrow. We don't need your poverty dragging down the wedding photos." She spun on her heels and swept back toward the bright lights. She was hoping I'd make a scene, give her a clean excuse to have me removed. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I reached calmly into my breast pocket and drew out the folded bill. I smoothed its creases flat against the table. At that exact moment, a young busboy burst through the swinging kitchen doors. He couldn't have been older than 19, hauling an enormous tray of dirty dishes, his arms shaking under the weight. He looked worn down and utterly invisible to the laughing, well-heeled guests all around him. I knew that feeling in my bones. I remembered pulling back-to-back double shifts on the freezing docks of Charleston Harbor, hands cracked and bleeding, scraping together just enough to keep the heat on. Back then, a single bill could be the line between eating and going without. Real wealth isn't sitting in some offshore account. It lives in understanding truly, understanding what hard labor costs a man. I never let myself forget that. As the young busboy hurried past my table, I quietly slid the crisp $100 bill beneath the edge of his tray. He froze, eyes dropping to the money, then lifting to my face with a look of stunned gratitude. I gave him a small nod and pressed a finger to my lips. He mouthed the silent thank you and disappeared back into the noise of the kitchen. With that settled, I turned my attention to the center of the room. Drake was holding court at the main table, surrounded by a captive audience hanging on his every word. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime, snapping at the waitstaff, demanding 3 more bottles of vintage champagne at $1,000 apiece, pouring freely, laughing loudly, playing the role of the reckless, untouchable billionaire hedge fund manager with practiced ease. But a man who has spent decades reading people sees what the crowd cannot. I watched Drake with careful, steady eyes, peeling back the expensive armor of his performance layer by layer. The head waiter approached from behind and leaned down to discreetly present a leather-bound booklet with the preliminary charges for the rehearsal dinner. Drake kept his wide, arrogant smile aimed at his audience. Then he opened the booklet and glanced at the total, and I caught it. It was a microscopic reaction, but to eyes trained on human behavior, it rang out like a gunshot. The muscles along his jaw clenched hard. The color bled slightly from his cheeks. His hand trembled a fraction before he gripped his glass tighter to cover it. He shot a quick, hunted glance around the room, the look of a man searching desperately for an exit. He scrawled his signature and shoved the booklet back at the waiter with unnecessary force, his smile returning a half-second too late. I settled back into my wobbly chair beside the kitchen doors, the roar of the upscale party receding into background noise. My instincts rang clear and loud and impossible to ignore. The lavish, performative spending, the hollow, unearned aggression, the raw terror in his eyes when confronted with a restaurant bill. This man was not a billionaire. He was drowning fast, and my only daughter was about to lash herself to his sinking ship. I waited until Drake was absorbed by a cluster of fawning bridesmaids. Then I made my move. I pushed up from my unsteady chair and wove through the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, looking for Sloane. I found her standing near a towering arrangement of white orchids. She looked breathtaking in her evening gown, but there was a tension wound into her shoulders, a stiffness that had no business being on a bride the night before her wedding. I approached slowly, my heavy boots landing in soft thuds against the polished hardwood. When she saw me coming, her posture tightened further. She fired a quick, nervous glance past my shoulder to check whether anyone important was watching. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "You should probably stay in your seat. The parents are circulating." "I just wanted to give you this," I replied, keeping my voice even, despite the cold reception. I reached into the side pocket of my jacket and produced a small, intricately carved wooden jewelry box made from rich walnut, cut from the very same wood I had salvaged off the first commercial cargo ship I ever bought decades ago. I had spent 3 weeks sanding it by hand in my private workshop, buffing the surface until the grain gleamed like glass. Her initials were engraved on the lid, the same way I used to carve her name into the little wooden blocks she played with as a child, before the divorce tore our daily lives in two. I held it out to her. "I made it for you to keep your new ring safe." Sloane stared down at the box. For one fleeting moment, a genuine flicker of warmth crossed her face. She remembered, but just as quickly that warmth was swallowed by a wave of embarrassment. Her eyes swept the room in a panic. Rather than opening it to look at the work inside, she snatched the box from my hands and tried to force it into her small designer clutch. It wouldn't fit. She fumbled with it awkwardly, her cheeks burning. "Thank you, Dad," she mumbled, staring at the floor. "I'll put it away later. Just please go sit down before Drake sees us together." It was already too late. Heavy, deliberate footsteps came up from behind me. A thick wave of expensive designer cologne announced Drake Fontaine's arrival before he said a word. "Well, what do we have here?" Drake asked, his voice booming over the soft background music. He stepped squarely between Sloane and me, cold eyes locked on the walnut box, still clutched in her hands. "It's nothing," Sloane stammered, shrinking under his gaze. "Just a small gift from my father." Drake didn't ask. He simply reached out and snatched the box from her hands. He held it up to the chandelier, light turning it with a slow, mocking inspection. A cruel, patronizing smile spread across his face. "Did you make this yourself, old man?" he asked, rotating the box carelessly between his fingers. "Looks like something you dig out of a bin at a cheap flea market or a dusty garage sale." I kept my expression completely neutral, hands folded calmly in front of me. "I carved it from solid walnut. It's a family tradition." Drake threw out a loud, theatrical laugh, precisely calibrated to pull the attention of the wealthy guests nearby. "A tradition?" he repeated, shaking his head in exaggerated pity. "Well, Sloane and I have far better traditions now. Ones that come in little blue boxes from Tiffany & Co. We don't exactly have space in our new penthouse for homemade arts and crafts." Sloane looked away. She didn't say a word in my defense. She didn't ask for the box back. She just stood there in silence, too terrified of upsetting the man she believed was her wealthy savior to do anything at all. Drake flagged down. A passing waiter lifted a heavy crystal glass of dark whiskey from the tray and took a long, deliberate sip. Then he looked back at me, smirk loaded with malice. Without breaking eye contact, he set the small walnut box down on a nearby cocktail table, and then with slow and absolute contempt, he placed his sweating glass directly on top of the carved lid. "Makes a fantastic coaster, though," he said, a vicious gleam in his eye. "Thanks for the little contribution, Garrett. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have real guests to attend to." The condensation from the glass was already bleeding into the polished wood, threatening to undo every hour I had poured into it. Every primal instinct in my body, every ounce of the raw authority I wielded as a man who had dominated boardrooms and dismantled hostile takeovers without breaking a sweat, screamed at me to grab him by that custom-tailored collar and tear his fake world apart right then and there. But I held back. A predator never moves when the prey is simply testing its boundaries. I needed him to feel completely untouchable. I drew a slow, measured breath and prepared to simply lift the glass and walk away. But before my hand even reached it, the mood in the room shifted without warning. The disruption didn't come from me. A man shouldered his way past the towering floral arrangements and moved with purpose directly toward our corner. He was no invited guest. He wore a cheap, heavily scuffed leather jacket over a dark, wrinkled t-shirt. His face was deeply weathered, his nose slightly off-center, and his eyes carried the flat, lifeless stare of someone who collected dangerous debts for a living. He paid no attention to the surrounding socialites and walked straight up behind Drake. Without a word, he reached out and seized Drake's tailored shoulder with a brutal grip. Drake spun around, fast mouth already open, to unleash his arrogance on whoever had dared touch him. But the instant Drake's eyes landed on the man's face, the mask shattered completely. The color vacated Drake's face all at once, leaving him pale as chalk. His jaw trembled. The booming voice that had been humiliating me only moments ago dissolved into nothing. He had no words. The man shoved Drake forward. Drake stumbled eyes wide with raw terror as the stranger pushed him hard into a dark, deserted hallway just behind us. I watched the door swing shut, cutting off the light. The music kept playing soft and completely detached from the violence I had just witnessed. No one else in the room seemed to notice a thing. The wealthy guests went on clinking their champagne flutes and laughing, entirely unaware that the groom had just been manhandled by a thug in a leather jacket. I turned back to Sloane. She stood stiff beside the floral arrangement, nervously working out the wrinkles on her gown. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes fixed on the hardwood floor. She had seen every bit of it, and she was trying desperately to act as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I moved toward her, slowly keeping my voice low and steady so as not to alarm her. I asked her who the man was and why he had grabbed Drake with that kind of force. Sloane fitted a bright, artificial smile onto her face before turning to look at me. When she finally met my eyes, they were fiercely guarded, armored by years of the status-obsessed conditioning her mother had built into her. She gave a short, dismissive laugh and waved her hand. "Oh, that's just an overzealous contractor," she said, smoothly delivering the lie with the polished precision of someone who had been handed a script. "Drake manages a $50 million hedge fund, Dad. He's an incredibly important figure in the financial district. People are constantly throwing themselves at him for investment money, and sometimes they get a little unhinged when he turns them down." I took in her words without a sound. A $50 million hedge fund manager does not get muscled into dark hallways by frustrated contractors. A man with genuine power at that level keeps a security detail, or at minimum holds his ground in public. Drake had folded like wet paper, his eyes screaming in pure animal terror. But Sloane needed desperately to believe her story, to protect the fragile fantasy she had built her future around. She tilted her chin up, in that familiar, imperious way Claudia had perfected over years. "Drake operates at incredibly high stakes all the time." She continued, her voice sharpening with a condescending edge. "It's a completely different world from what you're used to, Dad. He carries enormous pressure because he's out there building a real empire for our future." Before I could press her on the obvious gaps in that story, Sloane lifted her left hand with quiet pride. She spread her fingers wide, deliberately angling them to catch the light spilling from the crystal chandelier overhead. Resting on her ring finger was an enormous stone, easily 3 carats set in a thick platinum band that sat heavy on her hand. She gazed at it with a look of pure reverence, treating it not as a symbol of love, but as a gleaming trophy marking her ascent in the social order. "Drake had it custom-made just for me," she said, her voice colored with smug satisfaction. "He wanted to make sure I had absolutely the best. He told me a woman of my caliber deserves a diamond that commands respect the instant she walks into any room." I shifted my gaze from the stone to my daughter's face. The sharp, dismissive look she gave me back was her mother's expression down to the last detail. Then she delivered her calculated strike. "He gives me a life you never could, Dad," she said, her voice gone cold. "A life where I never have to worry about smelling like motor oil or settling for less than I deserve. You could learn quite a bit about success from a man like him." I swallowed the bitter pain that surged up through my chest. There is a particular kind of agony in hearing your own child speak to you with that level of contempt. It presses down on you like a physical weight. I had spent 40 years deliberately grinding through 80-hour weeks building a global shipping network from nothing, so that she would never once feel the crushing grip of poverty. And yet, here she stood utterly convinced that my worn work boots were a badge of failure, rather than the very foundation beneath her privileged existence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for my hidden bank statements. Instead, I brought my attention quietly to the stone on her left hand. "May I see it?" I asked, my tone mild and unhurried. Sloane hesitated, visibly caught off guard by the absence of any defensiveness in my response. She held her hand a few reluctant inches closer, arm kept rigid. I leaned in and studied the stone carefully under the unforgiving chandelier light. In the late 1990s, my international shipping company had locked in a major contract, transporting raw diamonds directly from South Africa to the finest jewelers across the country. For 5 solid years, I personally managed the complex logistics of those multi-million-dollar shipments. I spent long hours sitting inside secure vaults alongside master gemologists absorbing everything there was to know about identifying a genuine stone. I learned about internal fire, the precise way a real diamond bends and refracts, light throwing brilliant bursts of deep color outward from its core. I studied the large stone on Sloane's finger carefully. It was undeniably impressive cut, with mathematical precision flawless to any untrained eye. But as the chandelier struck the polished facets, something in my instincts fired immediately. The light refraction was wrong. Instead of the fierce electric brilliance of a genuine diamond, what bounced back was flat, glassy, and completely dead. There was no internal fire. It was brilliantly shiny on the surface, yes, but hollow through and through. A well-cut piece of cubic zirconia, completely fake. My heart dropped like a stone into my chest. The truth arrived with the force of a freight train. My daughter wasn't simply marrying an arrogant and unpleasant man. She was binding her entire life and future to a desperate, dangerous fraud. A man who loudly proclaimed a $50 million hedge fund to any room that would listen, but couldn't put a real diamond on his bride's finger. A man who had just been physically shoved around by a street-level debt collector in the middle of a secured Kiowa Island estate. The counterfeit ring, the terror in his eyes, the aggressive bluster engineered to bury his panic. All of it a beautifully constructed, desperately fragile house of cards. And Sloane was standing at its center. I had to move. Now. I released Sloane's hand, gently letting her step back behind the wall of her comfortable illusion. She smoothed her silk gown, gave me a guarded nod, and slipped away into the crowd of tailored tuxedos. I stood alone near the floral arrangements, letting the reality settle over me. My only daughter was marching straight into a burning building, and she was fiercely defending the man who had lit the match. I turned and walked back to my isolated chair beside the swinging kitchen doors. The jazz trio had gone quiet, their music replaced by the sharp ring of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The low hum of elite conversation faded into an expectant hush. At the front of the grand hall, perfectly lit beneath the largest chandelier, stood Drake Fontaine. He held a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a wireless microphone in the other. He radiated a toxic manufactured confidence that only a truly desperate man can produce. He let the silence build, savoring every set of eyes in the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Drake began, his voice rolling through the speakers with practiced cadence. "Tomorrow, I marry the most beautiful woman in the world. But tonight, I want to talk about legacy. I wanted to talk about what it means to build an empire from the ground up, to be a man who shapes the future rather than merely existing in it." He moved back and forth across the front of the room, making deliberate eye contact with the most affluent investors at the front tables. "Some of you know that my hedge fund has been aggressively pursuing a monumental commercial acquisition for the past 6 months," Drake continued. "It has been a grueling war of attrition against some of the oldest money in this city. But I am incredibly proud to announce tonight, in front of my future bride and my closest allies, that we have finally closed the deal." The room erupted in eager applause. Claudia beamed from the front row, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Drake raised his hand to settle them down, a smug smile spreading across his face. "We just secured the primary commercial rights to the Meridian Tower on Tryon Street," he declared, chest pushed forward. "The 50 stories of premium untouched Charlotte real estate. An absolute crown jewel, and it is officially ours." The applause rose again, louder this time. Drake waited, letting the adulation feed his fragile ego. Then his eyes began moving across the room. They passed over the billionaires, the socialites, and his beaming fiancée. They traveled all the way to the dark, isolated corner by the kitchen doors. His gaze locked directly onto me. The microphone caught his soft, mocking chuckle. "You know, building a legacy demands a certain kind of ruthless evolution," Drake said, his tone dropping into a condescending drawl. "It means leaving the old ways permanently behind. I look around this room and I see the absolute future, but I am also reminded of the pathetic past." He paused for effect, gesturing in my direction with his champagne flute. "Some men work until they are 70 years old, just to afford a rusted pickup truck and a cheap suit." The room went heavy with silence. "They break their backs for decades," Drake continued, his voice dripping with practiced cruelty, "convinced that blind grinding labor will somehow lead to greatness. But true greatness is not earned by sweating in the dirt like a peasant. I made my first million at 25. I am acquiring Charlotte skyscrapers before I turn 35. Cheers to rapid evolution, and cheers to leaving the dinosaurs exactly where they belong, buried in the past. He raised his glass high. A few of his groomsmen snickered and turned to stare directly at me in my dark corner. Claudia let out a short, mocking laugh, lifting her crystal glass in enthusiastic agreement. The cruelty in that room was a heavy, suffocating blanket of elitist contempt, aimed squarely at a man they had decided was a pathetic failure. I glanced over at Sloane. She was staring down at her lap, her face pale, her hands locked tightly together. She did not stand up. She did not defend the man who had pulled back-to-back freezing shifts at the docks to cover her childhood medical bills. She simply accepted my public humiliation as the price of entry into Drake's imaginary kingdom. I did not shift in my uncomfortable seat. I did not look away, and I did not show a single ounce of embarrassment or anger. I calmly reached out, picked up my plain glass of ice water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold slid smoothly down my throat, a perfect match for the absolute chill that had just settled permanently into my veins. Drake Fontaine was no master of the financial universe. He was a reckless, deeply foolish child, playing a dangerous game he did not remotely understand. I didn't need a corporate background check to know he was lying about his commercial acquisition. I didn't need my legal team to verify the current ownership status of the Meridian Tower on Tryon Street. I already knew exactly who owned that 50-story building. I purchased the Meridian Tower 12 years ago during a catastrophic market downturn. I gutted the entire structure, poured $60 million into renovating the commercial infrastructure, and placed it permanently inside a private, heavily guarded holding trust, strictly under the umbrella of Weston Enterprises. I am the sole owner. There are no outside investors, no hedge fund consortium, and no active negotiation of its commercial rights with anyone, let alone a petty fraud like Drake Fontaine. He had simply reached for the most impressive visible building he could conjure to dazzle a room full of wealthy strangers. He had no idea that the actual billionaire owner of that exact building was seated at the worst table in the room, wearing a 15-year-old suit and steel-toed work boots. The lie was so staggeringly large, so effortlessly verifiable to anyone with genuine corporate reach, that it locked in my darkest suspicions beyond any doubt. The scattered pieces snapped together cleanly in my mind. Drake was drowning in dangerous debt. He had a violent street-level debt collector crashing an exclusive rehearsal dinner. He had replaced what should have been a real diamond with a polished piece of cubic zirconia. And now he was publicly fabricating multi-million-dollar real estate deals to prop up a crumbling illusion of wealth. He wasn't just lying to my daughter. He was lying to his investors, his supposed friends, and whatever criminal element he had recklessly borrowed millions from. The dominoes were already falling, and Drake was dancing at the very bottom of the chain, completely blind to the destruction bearing down on him. He lifted another eager sip of his $1,000 champagne, basking in the warm glow of a kingdom he did not own. I set my water glass down on the table. The paternal fury that had briefly ignited inside me was gone, replaced by the cold, clinical focus of an apex predator methodically preparing to take apart its prey. Let him drink his expensive champagne. Let him absorb his unearned applause. Let him believe he had successfully humiliated the old clueless mechanic in front of the entire coastal elite. Tomorrow, the bill would come due, and I was going to collect every single penny. As the applause for his fabricated triumph finally began to thin, Drake raised his hand once more to quiet the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced his sleek, expensive smartphone. He studied the blank screen with exaggerated gravity furrowing his brow, as though an urgent message had just demanded his immediate attention. He leaned toward Sloane, whispered something in her ear, then addressed his captivated audience one final time. "I am terribly sorry to interrupt the celebration," Drake announced, his voice projecting a convincing performance of reluctant duty. "But when duty calls, a man has to answer. I have a scheduled conference call with a rather influential senator regarding some upcoming financial legislation on Wall Street. An absolute nuisance, I know, but these political figures simply do not respect the concept of a weekend. Please enjoy the caviar and keep the champagne flowing. I will be back shortly." The guests murmured in genuine awe, clearly impressed by his supposed connections in high places. Claudia nodded from the front row, her eyes bright with the particular gleam of a woman calculating the value of her future son-in-law. Drake pressed a quick, practiced kiss to Sloane's cheek, straightened his tie, and moved toward the exit. But I noticed something the room full of admiring socialites missed entirely. The moment Drake turned his back on the crowd and walked briskly toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the garden, his broad shoulders dropped. Every trace of the confident, arrogant swagger dissolved with each step he took away from the lights. His breathing turned shallow, his hands balled into tight fists as they swung at his sides. A man stepping away to take a routine call from a political contact moves with confidence. A man walking toward his own execution moves exactly the way Drake Fontaine was moving right now. I gave it a full 30 seconds before I pushed back my unsteady chair and rose from the table. Not a single soul noticed the old mechanic easing quietly out through the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen crew was far too consumed with plating the next course to give any thought to me threading my way through the narrow service corridor that ran directly to the estate's back gardens. The night air bit crisp and clean, laced with the sharp, briny smell of the Atlantic. The sprawling grounds spread out in a maze of neatly clipped hedges, marble statuary, and gurgling stone fountains, all washed in the soft glow of ambient landscape lighting. It was a genuinely lovely, peaceful scene. Tonight, though, it felt like a hunting ground. I stepped carefully onto the cobblestone path, the thick rubber soles of my old work boots swallowing the sound of each footfall. I moved in slow, deliberate steps, pressing close to the deep shadows thrown by the towering oaks. I didn't have to search long. From somewhere ahead came the frantic crunch of gravel from a secluded, dimly lit alcove tucked near the edge of the property line. I settled myself quietly behind a dense row of tall, manicured hedges. From that hidden vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the groom. Drake was completely alone, but the sleek, expensive smartphone he'd been flashing inside the dining hall was nowhere in sight. In its place, he was clutching a cheap, disposable burner phone, gripping it so hard his knuckles had gone pale. His hands trembled violently as he punched in a number. The change in him was genuinely startling. The smooth, untouchable billionaire was gone without a trace. What stood in that alcove instead was a terrified, desperate child. Sweat caught the pale moonlight on his forehead. He yanked frantically at the collar of his custom suit, as though it were tightening around his throat. He paced the gravel path in short, urgent strides, his chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. He pressed that cheap plastic phone to his ear, his whole body locked rigid with tension. When the other end picked up, Drake did not speak with the commanding authority of a hedge fund manager. He spoke in the high, wavering pitch of a man pleading for his own life. "Listen to me. You have to listen to me." Drake begged, his voice cracking under the weight of absolute desperation. "I know what the deadline was, but you cannot do this tonight." "Not tonight? I am literally standing at my rehearsal dinner right now. The wedding is tomorrow. You just need to give me a little more time. I swear on my life, I have everything completely under control." A brief silence fell as the person on the other end spoke. Whatever they said landed like a physical blow. Drake flinched hard, squeezed his eyes shut, and dragged a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, wrecking the expensive look entirely. "I am not trying to avoid you," Drake hissed, his voice dropping into a frantic, hushed rasp. "I am telling you the absolute truth. I just need 48 more hours. That is all I am asking for. 48 hours. The moment I marry her tomorrow afternoon, the marital trust fund automatically unlocks. Her grandfather left her a massive account, and as her husband, I will have full legal access to every single penny. You will get your $4 million back. I will even add a substantial interest payment on top for the delay. Just please do not send anyone else to the venue. You are going to ruin everything if you spook her family." Another heavy silence followed. Drake listened to the final chilling verdict from his ruthless creditor. A desperate, defeated gasp escaped him. "Please do not do that," Drake begged, tears of pure terror rising in his eyes. "I will have the $4 million by Monday morning. I promise you, just let me marry the girl." The line went dead. Drake stared at the burner phone in absolute horror. A raw, guttural sound of pure frustration tore out of him. He hurled the plastic device at the estate's brick wall, with everything he had sending it apart in pieces. Then he drove his foot into a heavy landscaping stone, cursing out loud into the empty night. He doubled over, hands braced on his knees, hauling in deep, shaking breaths as he tried to reassemble the facade. I stayed perfectly motionless, behind the thick hedges wrapped in cold shadow. The blazing alarm my gut had been sounding had just been confirmed in full. Drake Fontaine was not a successful businessman. He was a monumental fraud who owed $4 million to extraordinarily dangerous people. He was using my daughter, planning to drain her protective trust fund the instant the ink dried on their marriage certificate. He saw Sloane as nothing more than a convenient, wealthy sacrifice to save his own miserable skin. I turned slowly away from the alcove and walked silently back toward the kitchen doors. I had heard enough. The time for gathering quiet clues was over. It was time to set into motion the actions that would protect my only daughter. I would burn his counterfeit empire to ash and make certain he never threatened my family again. The ruthless instinct I'd buried for years was fully, completely awake. I slipped back through the garden path, leaving Drake to his unraveling reality. When I stepped back into the grand dining hall, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The formal dinner service had wrapped up, and the wealthy guests were drifting toward the marble dance floor. I watched from the shadows as Drake made his entrance. He strode back into the room, wearing his arrogant swagger like a second skin, tugging his suit jacket straight and throwing out an empty smile. He pulled Sloane in by the waist and steered her onto the dance floor. They spun beneath the crystal chandeliers, a picture of absolute perfection. To any unsuspecting eye, he was a confident billionaire, savoring his last night as a bachelor. But I knew the truth. I knew that beneath the silk and the cologne, he was drenched in the terror of a man who owed $4 million to genuine monsters. But knowing the truth and proving it to a daughter who has been thoroughly convinced are two entirely different battles. Sloane had spent 2 years immersing herself in Drake's fantasy world. She would not take the word of a father she had written off as a bitter old mechanic. If I walked up to her with nothing but a story about an overheard phone call, she would go straight to Drake. He would almost certainly convince her to elope that very night, cutting me out of her life for good, and locking up access to her trust fund in the process. I needed physical, undeniable proof. I needed hard evidence so devastating that it would shatter his illusion completely. Evidence Sloane could not look away from, could not explain, could not deny. I turned from the dance floor and walked with purpose toward the grand foyer. I pushed through the front doors, leaving the music behind. The circular driveway stretched before me, crushed gravel lined with the finest luxury vehicles money could buy. I stood at the top of the stone steps, scanning the glittering row of automotive wealth. I was looking for one specific car. Earlier that evening, Drake had spent a full 20 minutes loudly boasting to older investors about his brand new custom-ordered Maserati Gran Turismo. Every word out of his mouth was a precisely crafted lie, engineered to dazzle the wealthy crowd around him. He called it a spontaneous purchase, a small reward to himself for closing the Charlotte commercial acquisition. I spotted the sleek midnight black Maserati Gran Turismo, parked prominently near the head of the VIP line. I descended the stone steps and approached the valet podium. A young attendant moved to assist me. I reached into my pocket and produced a crisp $100 bill, folded it once and slid it across the wooden counter. I told the young man that my future son-in-law had accidentally left a critical wedding document locked inside his Maserati, and I needed 5 minutes alone with the car to retrieve it. The valet glanced at the money, then at my steady, unyielding expression. He slipped the bill into his pocket without a word, placed the electronic key fob in my hand, and turned his attention to another guest. I crossed the lot to the black Maserati and pressed the unlock button. The headlights flashed sharp in the darkness. I pulled the heavy door open and leaned inside. To anyone else, this car was the ultimate trophy of financial success. But my entire life had been built around engines and mechanical systems. I know how to see past a polished exterior. I settled into the low driver's seat and popped open the glove box. A man who genuinely owns a high-performance vehicle keeps meticulous records, registration, insurance documents, service warranties all neatly in order. The glove box was nearly empty. The only thing inside was a single brightly colored manila folder. I pulled it free and clicked on the overhead dome light. I opened the cover and started reading. The logo printed at the top of the page belonged to no exclusive dealership or upscale leasing agency. It was the mark of a notoriously shady exotic car rental outfit operating on the fringes of the city. I scanned the rental agreement carefully. Drake Fontaine had not purchased this car. He hadn't even leased it. He had rented it by the hour. The contract spelled out a strict 24-hour rental period beginning the previous afternoon and expiring tomorrow morning, right before the wedding ceremony. He had paid an obscene predatory rate simply to have the car sitting in a valet line for a single evening, all to prop up his crumbling illusion of wealth. I folded the rental agreement and tucked it carefully into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. But something in my gut said there was more waiting to be found. A man this cornered always leaves a messy trail of errors scattered behind him. I started working through the rest of the cabin. As I leaned across to check the passenger side floorboard, my hand caught the edge of a crumpled, heavily creased piece of bright yellow paper that had been shoved carelessly under the seat. I pulled it out and pressed the sharp folds flat against my knee. Then, I held it up to the overhead dome light. It was a formal legal document bearing the official seal of the City Housing Court. The heavy black letters across the top read "Final Notice of Eviction." I worked through the details. The document was addressed to Drake Fontaine by name. It listed a small, deeply modest apartment in a rundown neighborhood miles removed from the wealthy financial district he claimed to command. According to the court order, Drake was more than 6 months in arrears on basic rent. The landlord had already secured a legal judgment, and city marshals were scheduled to physically remove his belongings and lock him out of the property by next Tuesday. I settled back against the leather seat as the full scale of his deception rolled over me in a cold wave. Drake wasn't just broke, he was completely destitute. The self-declared billionaire hedge fund manager, the man who had sneered at my boots, the man who boasted about buying skyscrapers in Charlotte, was days away from sleeping on the street. The expensive suit was in all likelihood rented. The champagne was being run on a fraudulent tab he never intended to honor. And his entire survival, his desperate scheme to pay off violent creditors and stay off the pavement, hinged entirely on tricking my daughter into signing a marriage certificate tomorrow afternoon. I folded the yellow eviction notice and placed it alongside the rental agreement in my breast pocket. I switched off the dome, light climbed out of the rented Maserati Gran Turismo, and pressed the door shut behind me. I returned to the valet podium, handed the key fob back to the young attendant with a quiet nod of thanks, and turned back toward the estate. The night air felt electric now, in a way it hadn't before. The suffocating weight of uncertainty had lifted, completely replaced by the cold, focused clarity of a father readying himself for war. Tomorrow, the grand illusion would come apart in front of everyone, and I would be the one with the hammer in my hand. I climbed the wide stone steps at an unhurried pace. The cold air had sharpened my thinking. Every footstep felt deliberate, grounded. Inside the main hall, the evening had built to a roar. The heavy throb of modern dance music pulsed straight through the thick wooden doors. I skirted the crowded ballroom entirely. I had no interest in watching a room full of oblivious socialites pay tribute to a false god. Instead, I moved through a quiet, softly lit corridor toward the men's restroom. The heavy mahogany door stood slightly ajar. The moment I pushed it open, the thumping bass cut out, replaced by the harsh, hollow sound of labored, panicked breathing ricocheting off stone walls. I stepped in without a sound, easing the door shut behind me. The restroom was an extravagant study in marble and brass sharp, with the scent of citrus hand soap and Drake Fontaine's suffocating designer cologne. Drake stood alone at the far end of the long vanity counter. His tuxedo jacket had been stripped off and flung carelessly onto the spotless floor. His silk tie was wrenched loose, hanging at a crooked angle from his collar. He was braced over the polished marble sink, both hands locked on the brass fixtures so hard his knuckles had gone bone white. He cranked the gold faucet to full force and drove freezing water into his own face with both hands. He gasped sharply, shoulders lurching as he fought to drag air into his lungs. He was deep in the grip of a full-blown panic attack. Every trace of the untouchable billionaire persona had dissolved, leaving nothing behind but a trapped, cornered animal. I stayed still near the entrance, watching him with clinical detachment. He muttered fragmented, desperate curses at his own dripping reflection in the wide vanity mirror. For a long beat, Drake had no idea I was there. He kept hyperventilating, slapping cold water against his ashen skin, trying to force his nervous system back under control. When he finally lifted his head and reached for a hand towel, his darting eyes swept across the mirror and found my reflection standing directly behind him. The change came instantly, and it was pathetic to witness. The raw terror drained from his face in an eye blink, swapped out for a sudden surge of manufactured fury. It was the overblown aggression of a weak man who senses he's been caught. He wheeled around, water dripping from his chin and soaking into his dress shirt collar. His chest swelled, his eyes narrowing to a vicious squint. He closed the distance in 2 quick steps, his dress shoes skating slightly on the slick marble floor. "What are you doing sneaking around back here, you creepy old mechanic?" Drake spat, his voice trembling as he tried to hold it steady. Are you stalking me now? I kept my hands loose at my sides, my posture easy. I'm simply using the restroom, Drake. I answered, my voice stripped of any emotion. You don't look well. Should I go find a doctor? That plain measured observation snapped whatever thin thread of restraint he had remaining. The humiliation of being seen unraveling by a man he had written off as worthless was more than he could absorb. Drake lunged forward on a burst of hollow arrogance. He grabbed my lapels with his wet hands and shoved me backward. My lower back caught the edge of the marble vanity with a dull thud. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my hands. I stood there like a load-bearing wall, completely unmoved by the frantic, shaking force of a frightened boy. Drake pressed his face close to mine. He smelled of expensive whiskey, stale fear, and cold sweat. Listen to me very closely, you pathetic old man, he hissed, spit, catching the light as he strained to project menace. I have been generous letting you sit in that dining hall tonight. I have tolerated your miserable presence because Sloane begged me to be a nice guy, but this is my world. You do not belong here. You are nothing but a dirty mechanic who failed his family. I want you to stay out of my way tomorrow. You sit in the back row. You keep your mouth shut. And you do not embarrass my beautiful bride with your disgusting poverty. If you ruin my perfect wedding, I will personally destroy what little life you have left. Do you understand me? He shoved me hard against the marble sink one final time for emphasis, then let go of my lapels as abruptly as he had grabbed them, stepping back as though the fabric had contaminated him. He stood there panting, waiting for me to shrink, to apologize, to give him the cowering submission he needed so badly. I gave him none of it. I simply held his gaze, my face completely empty. I reached up slowly and straightened the collar of my suit jacket, smoothing the creases his wet hands had pressed into the cloth. The silence in that restroom spread out between us, heavy and suffocating. My absolute refusal to be rattled frightened him far more than any punch ever could have. A predator recognizes a lesser creature on instinct, and somewhere in the hollowed-out center of him, Drake knew his performance had fallen flat. He swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. Without waiting for me to say a word, he spun away and snatched his tuxedo jacket from the wet floor. He thrust a hand blindly toward his back pocket, going for his thick leather wallet, fumbling to shove some loose bills inside in a manic rush. His hands were shaking too badly for even that simple task. As he forced the leather wallet back toward the pocket of his tailored trousers, he missed the opening completely. The wallet clipped the edge of the fabric, tumbling awkwardly in his grip. He cursed under his breath, snatched it back, and jammed it home on the second attempt. He pivoted sharply and drove himself out of the restroom, slamming the mahogany door so hard the echo rang off every wall. Then the sound faded, and the lavish room fell into absolute silence once more. What I was about to uncover in that restroom would expose the full depth of just how far this man was willing to go, and how many lives he was willing to destroy to keep his illusion alive. Before I share it, tell me this. If you suspected someone close to you was working against you in secret, would you confront them directly, or would you wait and build your case in silence? I stood at the marble vanity, breathing in the quiet calm of the empty restroom. My eyes dropped to the exact spot where Drake had frantically fumbled with his expensive leather wallet just moments before. Resting silently on the intricate geometric tile was a very small rectangular slip of bright pink paper. It had drifted completely unnoticed from his overstuffed wallet during his panicked exit. I stepped forward, crouched slowly, and lifted the small slip between my calloused fingers. The heavy cardstock texture felt immediately familiar. This was no restaurant receipt or business card. It was an official pawnshop transaction ticket. I turned it over and read the faded black ink printed across the front. The ticket clearly documented the recent sale of a vintage, highly recognizable diamond necklace pawned for a fraction of its true worth, just to desperately bankroll a cubic zirconia ring. It was the final piece of physical evidence. I held the small pink slip up to the harsh fluorescent light above the vanity mirror. My callous thumb moved across the faded ink as my mind worked to absorb the devastating information printed on that heavy cardstock. It was an official transaction record from a notoriously discreet pawnbroker operating deep within Jewelers Row. The date stamped in the top right corner was exactly 3 months ago. That was the very same week Drake had formally asked for my daughter's hand in marriage. I studied the detailed item description, feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The receipt didn't list a generic piece of jewelry. It explicitly described the exact cut, clarity, and weight of a flawless 3-carat diamond. My breathing slowed as the devastating truth snapped into place. Drake had not commissioned a custom ring to lavish my daughter with luxury. He had taken the Antiques family heirloom ring that Sloane's late grandmother had entrusted to him for the proposal. He had coldly pried the priceless, flawless, generational diamond right out of its antique platinum setting. He sold her family's precious legacy for fast cash to rescue his own miserable life. Then, to cover his tracks, he had a cheap cubic zirconia mounted into her grandmother's original setting. He presented it to Sloane as a stunning custom upgrade, preying entirely on her manufactured desire for high society validation. She wore the fake stone with pride, completely unaware that the real diamond, the very emblem of her family's history, had been handed off to a stranger for cash. I read the final payout amount printed in bold at the bottom of the pink slip. It was a substantial sum of liquid cash, more than enough to cover large, urgent personal expenses without a moment's hesitation. My mind immediately connected the specific date on the pawn receipt to another critical point in the timeline. 3 months ago was the exact same week Claudia had proudly announced that Drake had secured this magnificent exclusive coastal estate for the wedding weekend. She had boasted to anyone willing to listen about how Drake had generously covered the astronomical venue deposit entirely in cash up front. The puzzle was now fully solved. He hadn't used hedge fund profits to finance this lavish rehearsal dinner. He had used the stolen proceeds from Sloane's own family inheritance to prop up his pathetic grand illusion. Sloane was standing on the precipice of an absolute disaster, joyfully preparing to marry a deeply dangerous, utterly desperate fraud. The man she believed was a billionaire was in reality a penniless con artist, actively fleeing violent criminals. He was using her to survive, planning to drain her grandfather's massive trust fund the instant the wedding was legally finalized tomorrow. I folded the pink slip precisely in half and slid it securely into my breast pocket alongside the rented Maserati Gran Turismo, documents, and the legal eviction notice. I now held the complete, irrefutable blueprint of his entire dark deception. The overwhelming urge to march straight onto the dance floor and haul him out by his rented lapels surged through my veins. Every protective paternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to grab my daughter, hold up the pink slip for the whole crowd to see, and tear his counterfeit kingdom apart on the spot. But I forced my racing pulse to slow. I shut my eyes and drew a long, steadying breath in the quiet of that restroom. Acting on raw emotion is how ordinary men lose wars. A true apex predator understands the absolute importance of timing, undeniable leverage, and overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment. If I simply walked out there and told Sloane the truth right now, she would never believe me. Claudia's toxic materialism had been working on her for years. To Sloane, I was nothing more than the poor, bitter father who lived in a dusty trailer park, desperately trying to drag her down from her glorious ascent into high society. She would look at the pawn receipt, and Drake would effortlessly spin another smooth, convincing lie. He would frame it as a complex investment strategy or a short-term business arrangement, and she would swallow every single word just to protect the fantasy she had built. A single piece of paper was not enough to break the deep spell he had cast over her. I needed to back him into a public corner, so tight that no amount of smooth talking could pull him free. I needed to let him raise his glorious pedestal as high as it would go, so that the fall would be permanent and total. The tension in my jaw finally released as the strategy locked into place in my mind. I could not fight this battle from behind the disguise of a forgotten mechanic. I needed to bring the full, terrifying weight of my actual financial empire down on top of him. I left the quiet restroom and walked straight through the vibrant, laughing crowd of wealthy guests without a word to anyone. I did not pause to look at Sloane, who was still spinning blissfully on the marble dance floor in the arms of a complete fraud. I did not acknowledge Claudia, who was aggressively flagging down a passing waiter with her empty champagne flute. I pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the cool, dark night. I approached the valet, asked for my old, battered pickup truck, and waited in the damp, refreshing coastal breeze. When the young attendant pulled my truck around, he gave me a look of mild, sympathetic pity, with no idea he was handing the keys to a man who could purchase this entire estate with a single phone call. I settled into the torn driver's seat, turned the ignition, and let the familiar roar of the engine wash over me. I eased slowly out of the circular gravel driveway, leaving the bright, hollow mansion behind. The drive back to my modest rented motel room on the edge of town was silent, deeply purposeful, and completely focused. Once inside my quiet room, I retrieved my encrypted satellite phone from my duffel bag. This was the direct line reserved solely for coordinating high-level global logistics and major corporate acquisitions. I dialed the private number of my chief legal counsel, a brilliant, absolutely ruthless attorney named Alden. He picked up on the second ring, fully accustomed to late-night directives from me. I instructed him to immediately acquire the entire commercial debt portfolio of Drake Fontaine, every loan, every outstanding marker, every legal obligation Drake had ever signed. I wanted all of it transferred into my name. Alden did not waste time with unnecessary questions. He simply assured me the directive would be executed flawlessly before the sun rose over the eastern seaboard. I ended the call and set the phone on the bedside table. I reached into my breast pocket and withdrew the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, and the eviction notice. I laid all three side by side on the cheap mattress. Tomorrow, Sloane would walk down the aisle expecting a fairy tale. Instead, I was going to deliver a devastating, unstoppable storm of absolute, undeniable truth. Drake Fontaine was about to lose everything. The cheap motel walls were paper-thin, vibrating slightly low, with the heavy sound of a passing semi-truck on the nearby highway. I stared at the 3 pieces of paper spread across the faded bedspread, the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, and the eviction notice. Alden was already moving through the legitimate financial markets, acquiring whatever visible commercial debt Drake had foolishly accumulated. But the desperate, panicked phone call I had witnessed in the garden demanded an entirely different approach. Commercial banks do not dispatch thugs in cheap leather jackets to physically threaten clients at formal wedding rehearsals. That brand of aggressive intimidation belongs strictly to the violent shadow economy. I needed absolute security for this next phase. I picked up my keys, stepped out of the dingy room, and walked back to my rusted 2003 Chevy Silverado, parked beneath a flickering amber street lamp. The coastal air was thick with salt and damp fog. I climbed into the familiar driver's seat and firmly locked the heavy metal doors, sealing myself inside the quiet, insulated cabin. I reached down beneath the worn floor mats and popped open a hidden reinforced steel compartment. I pulled out my primary encrypted satellite phone. This device was completely untraceable, entirely off the public grid, and reserved exclusively for the most critical high-stakes operations of my global empire. The number I punched in was a heavily encrypted international line I kept for exactly this kind of work. It connected on the second beat. This call wasn't going to Alden. It was going to Conrad, the ruthlessly efficient fixer and lead shadow counsel for the most aggressive, darkest operating divisions of Weston Enterprises. Corporate mergers and press management weren't his territory. Conrad lived in the raw, unforgiving world of international leverage and hard pressure. He picked up with the low, granite-steady voice that made people listen without being asked twice. Conrad, I said, my own tone calibrated to a cold, precise edge. I need a level 1 dig on a man called Drake Fontaine, and I don't want his public filings touched. Go straight to the underground lending networks running through the tri-state area. Already moving. Conrad answered smooth and unhurried. Tell me what we're hunting tonight. Someone in the shadow market is sitting on a $4 million marker against him, I told him. The deadline is Monday morning. They're already putting boots on the ground at public events to squeeze him. I want that debt, Conrad. Find the exact syndicate holding his paper. Purchase it entirely through our untraceable shell structure. Whatever those loan sharks or cartel players are asking for, that marker double the figure and clean offshore funds no trail. When the sun comes up tomorrow, I want to be the one and only person who owns Drake Fontaine's future. I'll have the right hands shaken within the hour, Sir Conrad said, zero hesitation in his voice. Legal ownership will land in your primary blind trust well before any legitimate bank unlocks its doors. I set the satellite phone in the empty seat beside me and dropped my head back against the headrest, staring out through the fog-blurred windshield. That flickering amber lamp above the parking lot threw warped shadows across the cracked asphalt. My mind was running cold calculations on the scale of what I'd just set into motion. For years, decades, Claudia had been dripping poison into my daughter's ear, insisting that real power wore loud, expensive clothes and announced itself at every room it entered. She had shaped Sloane into someone who worshipped the gleaming facade of a man like Drake, while treating honest, back-breaking work as something shameful. Drake was the perfect creature, that philosophy produces a man who'd burned his whole adult life chasing props instead of building anything real. A pawned diamond, a rented car, a hedge fund that existed only on paper. Every prop had been arranged with one purpose: manufacturing the appearance of total dominance. But strip the costume off and there was nothing underneath. No foundation, no substance, just a hollow figure balanced on collapsing ground. Because genuine power doesn't announce itself at rehearsal dinners. Genuine power doesn't need to grind a mechanic's face into the dirt just to measure itself against something. Genuine power looks like a man alone at 3 in the morning in a rusted pickup truck in an empty motel lot, making one quiet phone call that seizes another man's entire existence, his debts, his freedom, every inch of his future, without raising a voice or throwing a single punch. I shut my eyes and worked my breathing down to something slow and even. The fury was still there. I could feel it like a forge burning behind my ribs, but every degree of it was leashed and aimed. This wasn't vengeance. It was surgery. Precise, necessary, and long overdue, done, for one reason only: to pull my daughter back from the edge before she stepped off it permanently. She was going to despise me for dismantling what she believed was her dream. There would be tears. There would be screaming. She might decide to erase me from her life entirely, but a father who only acts when his child will thank him afterward isn't protecting anyone, he's protecting himself. You do what needs doing because the duty is sacred even when the cost is everything. The hours moved like cold water through the silent cab. Gradually, the dense coastal fog began thinning at the edges, and the first weak gray of dawn started seeping up from the horizon. Then the satellite phone jumped against the seat. I had it in my hand before the second vibration. "It's done, sir." Conrad reported, his voice carrying the clean, flat authority of a man who delivers results. The syndicate holding the $4 million marker was eager to move. They'd already written Fontaine off as a flight risk they couldn't control. We routed exactly $8 million through the secondary offshore shell. The digital marker and every piece of physical blackmail material they were holding over him, it all transferred. You own it now, clean and permanent. Did the buyer's identity surface at any point? I asked, my eyes tracking the sunrise as it crept across the rusted hood of my old truck. "Not even close," Conrad said evenly. They were far too pleased about doubling their money overnight to ask inconvenient questions. Drake Fontaine now carries a $4 million debt payable to you, callable the moment you choose to pull the trigger. Full leverage. Yours alone. "Good work, Conrad," I said, keeping it quiet and flat. "Stay close this afternoon. I'll have further instructions." I killed the line and pressed the phone back into the hidden compartment beneath the floor mat. The weapon I needed was loaded. I climbed out of the truck, crossed the lot, and let myself back into the motel room. There was work to do before the ceremony. I shook out my clean, well-pressed navy suit from JCPenney that I had bought 15 years ago and laid it carefully across the bed. I ran a cloth over my steel-toed work boots until they held a dull, respectable shine. I assembled the evidence: pawn receipt, rental agreement, eviction notice, digital debt confirmation, folded each piece with precision and set them in a neat stack. Morning light pushed through the thin curtains as I stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, working the buttons of my navy suit closed. The fabric sat rigid against my frame, nothing like the Italian wool I wore when I operated as myself. I tugged on my work boots. Then I picked up the folded stack, the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, the eviction notice, and the confirmation of Drake Fontaine's $4 million criminal debt, and pressed them into my inner breast pocket, flat against my chest, a concealed weapon patient and ready. I pointed the 2003 Chevy Silverado toward the coastal estate and drove. The grounds were already in controlled chaos by the time I rolled through. Florists hauled armloads of white roses toward tall arrangements. Catering crews shouted across each other, while the outdoor dining tents went up in sections. I pulled around to the service entrance and kept well clear of the main activity. Invisibility was the whole game until the moment I chose otherwise. Less than 10 minutes later, Claudia found me. She was cutting a hard line across the grass, a clipboard jammed under one arm, snapping instructions into a silver earpiece. Every muscle in her face was locked in the particular tension of a woman determined to make everything look effortless. The second her gaze snagged on me, that tension sharpened into something more personal. She ended the call mid-sentence and came straight at me. "Garrett, you are completely useless standing around here like a lost vagrant." She said the words hitting like something thrown. The delivery truck just pulled up at the back gate. It's got the bulk ice for the outdoor bars. The catering company wants an extra $200 just to carry it off the truck. We are not throwing money away on labor. We don't have to pay when this venue is already costing a fortune. Get yourself down to that loading dock and unload those 60 bags of ice. Make yourself useful for once. I held her gaze for a beat. A man who runs global shipping operations doesn't haul ice to save 200, but a man who has set a perfect trap doesn't break his cover for pride. I held my tongue. I swallowed whatever response wanted to come out. I dipped my head in a slow, quiet nod and turned toward the gravel dock at the back of the estate. Claudia and Drake both needed to feel like their control over me was total, like I was exactly what they thought I was, and no threat to anyone. The refrigerated truck sat rumbling near the rear gate, its doors hanging open to reveal pallets of bagged commercial ice stacked chest high. Each bag weighed 40 lb. I turned back my sleeves, baring forearms that had done this kind of work before, and reached into the frozen cargo for the first bag. The cold knifed through the thin fabric of my suit the second I shouldered the weight. I set off across the property toward the reception tents, settling into the breathing pattern, slow, deliberate, rhythmic, that I'd first learned hauling freight on the icy docks of Charleston Harbor, long before I ever owned a single ship. I was carrying the fourth bag across the courtyard when a sharp burst of laughter cracked the morning air from the stone patio overhead. Drake Fontaine had stepped out of the main house, flanked by 5 groomsmen in a tight cluster. All of them wore matching custom-tailored suits and held crystal glasses brimming with morning mimosas. They gazed down at me from their elevated balcony the way ancient kings might study a field hand. Drake extended a manicured finger in my direction, a cruel theatrical grin spreading across his freshly shaved face. "Get a look at this, boys," he called out, pitching his voice loud enough to make sure it reached me. He draped himself over the ornate stone railing and shook his head in exaggerated sympathy. "I told you, we had our very own personal pack mule for the weekend." The groomsmen broke into harsh, cutting laughter. A tall one with his hair slicked back hoisted his glass in a mocking salute. "Now move it along, old man," he hollered down. "That champagne won't chill itself. Pick up the pace before you throw your hip out." I didn't miss a step. I didn't glance toward the balcony. I kept my chin down, playing the role of the broken, humiliated father with total commitment. I let the icy meltwater run down the back of my neck and seep into my collar. I hauled the 5th bag, then the 10th, then the 20th. My shoulders burned and my hands went numb against the biting cold. The physical punishment was real, but it registered as background noise against the razor-sharp focus blazing inside my head. Every time those men laughed, every time Drake fired another degrading insult down from his comfortable perch, I felt a precise, wordless pulse against my thigh. My encrypted satellite phone kept vibrating inside my trouser pocket, Conrad sending me automated tactical updates in real time from the Weston Enterprises war room. Each silent buzz was another precision strike landing against Drake's hollow empire. Buzz. Our shell corporations had completed the formal transfer of his $4 million criminal debt. Buzz. The underground syndicate had cleared the offshore payment and permanently washed their hands of Drake Fontaine. Buzz. Our legal team had successfully frozen all 3 of his primary bank accounts using the leverage we now held. Buzz. His fraudulent hedge fund operations had been formally flagged to the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. The trap wasn't merely closing anymore. It was snapping shut with bone-crushing inescapable force. I shouldered the 30th bag of ice. I moved through the rose gardens while the groomsmen kept up their mockery from above. They had no understanding that they were ridiculing the man who now held the deed to every breath Drake Fontaine drew. I carried the 40th bag. Claudia swept past me and offered a satisfied smirk when she caught sight of the dark sweat stains spreading across my suit jacket. I lifted the 60th and final bag. As the weight came off the pallet, the phone delivered one long, sustained vibration against my leg, the final confirmation. Conrad had secured the ultimate kill switch. I walked the last bag to the outdoor bar and dropped it into the stainless steel cooler with a dull, heavy thud. I straightened up, working the stiffness out of my back. The labor was done. The degrading performance had served its purpose. I smoothed my damp sleeves back down and fastened the buttons of my jacket. The sun was fully overhead, flooding the estate in sharp morning light. The ceremony was less than 3 hours away. I looked up at the stone balcony. Drake was still up there, grinning with the relaxed arrogance of a man who has no idea he is already finished. I turned and made my way toward the guest seating area, completely ready to watch everything come down. I turned and walked toward the guest seating, ready to watch every piece of it burn. The coastal estate had remade itself into a grand spectacle of high society extravagance. Towering floral arches of white roses and imported orchids lined the central aisle. A jazz trio played softly in the corner beneath a sprawling oak, filling the warm morning with low, elegant sound. Guests were arriving steadily, designer gowns, sharp-tailored suits drifting across the manicured lawn, with glasses of sparkling water pausing to take in the sweeping ocean view. I settled near the back row of the seating arrangement, unremarkable in my damp, inexpensive suit, invisible to everyone around me. Claudia worked the crowd like a general on a battlefield, moving from cluster to cluster with her polished, practiced smile, making sure every notable guest registered just how magnificently everything had been arranged. I caught a brief glimpse of Sloane as she appeared on the upper balcony of the main house, encircled by bridesmaids and makeup artists all moving at once. Even from that distance, the joy on her face was unmistakable and completely genuine. She looked out over the assembled crowd below, with the wide, luminous expression of someone who believes entirely in the dream surrounding her. Watching her tore something loose in my chest. She was utterly convinced she was marrying a generous, accomplished man who would spend his life honoring and protecting her. She had no knowledge whatsoever that she was walking straight into a trap engineered by someone who viewed her as a financial instrument, nothing more. I checked the heavy titanium watch strapped to my wrist. It was exactly 30 minutes before the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin. The air hummed with anticipation, but my attention was locked entirely on the tactical timeline Conrad had put in place. I eased away from the swelling crowd of guests, slipped past the usher station, and followed a narrow cobblestone path that traced the outer edge of the estate. It curved around the back of the catering tents and delivered me into a shaded service alleyway tucked behind the main kitchen. The industrial clatter of pots and the raised voices of catering staff dulled as I stepped into the cool shadow of the brick corridor. It was a hidden pocket of quiet behind all that glittering perfection. I stood without moving, waiting in the damp coastal air. 60 seconds later, a sleek black sedan rolled silently to a stop at the service gate. The man who emerged wasn't any kind of delivery driver. He wore a dark, precisely fitted suit, dark glasses, and an earpiece. Every movement he made carried the measured efficiency of a trained corporate security operative. He picked me out from the shadows without hesitation and came directly toward me. He stopped 3 feet away and reached into his jacket. Not a word. He simply extended his hand, presenting a thick black leather folder, its surface embossed with a small silver crest, the mark of Weston Enterprises. I took it from him. He gave a single measured nod, pivoted cleanly, and walked back to the sedan. The car reversed out of the service gate and disappeared down the coastal road, leaving the alley entirely silent. I set my shoulders against the cold brick wall and pulled in a slow breath. I broke the wax seal, lifted the leather flap, and opened the folder. The documents inside represented the full product of the previous night's work. I was prepared to find the standard predatory loan terms, the punishing interest structures, and the explicit threats of physical enforcement that come with criminal market debt. But as I moved past the opening financial summaries and worked into the core contractual language, the temperature in my blood dropped sharply. The true depth of Drake's scheme was something far darker than I had built into my worst assumptions. Drake Fontaine had not simply taken out a $4 million loan to sustain his fraudulent lifestyle. He hadn't just put his own name on a dangerous marker with a violent organization. He had deliberately, systematically committed high-level identity theft. I fixed my eyes on the bold print across the central collateral agreement. Her full legal name was right there on the page, undeniable. Directly beneath it, her exact social security number and the sensitive routing details for her generational marital trust fund. Drake had forged her signature on the syndicate's primary collateral documents with calculated precision. He had named my daughter, my only daughter, as the sole financial guarantor for his criminal debt. If Drake failed to deliver the $4 million, the syndicate wasn't coming after him. Those forged documents gave them full legal authorization to strip that trust fund bare. He had offered her up as a human shield to absorb the consequences of his own wreckage. The depth of sociopathic calculation behind that plan was staggering to take in. 2 years of manufactured affection, A pawned heirloom diamond, a rented car, every single element had been a tool to get close enough to her private financial records to execute this theft on a massive scale. A cold, absolute fury settled into the marrow of my bones. Watching from the shadows was finished. I drew the encrypted satellite phone from my pocket and dialed. He answered before the second ring. "Conrad," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was quiet in the way that a collapsed mine shaft is quiet. The black folder was in my possession. The collateral agreement I'd read every word. He'd falsified her signature, her identity weaponized to back the whole marker. I reviewed it myself. Sir Conrad said, his voice perfectly even. "The fraud here is brazen beyond anything ordinary. We've pulled a complete digital trail. He broke into her private financial records a full 3 days before he drew down that illegal loan. Every exit is blocked. Move on the acquisition now." My gaze drifted out toward the sun-filled courtyard beyond the mouth of the alley. "Pull every offshore dollar we have and move it. Cost is irrelevant. Acquire the debt. Make it happen. I need ironclad, undisputed control over all of it." "Wire transfer is already underway," Sir Conrad reported. "The cartel has formally surrendered every claim. All debt belonging to Drake Fontaine, his crooked contracts, his entire trajectory belongs solely to you now. The man is yours." I killed the call and tucked the phone away. That thick folder sat in my grip like a weapon primed to fire. The elaborate con Drake had been running for so long was finally about to detonate in his face. I emerged from the alley's shadow and stepped back into the afternoon sun. The moment had arrived. It was time to watch Sloane's wedding. The seaside ceremony unfolded like a faultlessly staged production, every detail polished, every gesture choreographed. I claimed a seat in the very last row, the cheap white folding chairs arranged in a perfect arc before me, and watched my daughter commit her future to a man whose only intention was to gut her financially and vanish. Sloane was luminous, her gown immaculate, her expression alight with a joy she had no reason to doubt. Drake inhabited the role of the anguished, adoring billionaire groom without missing a single beat. Fingers laced through hers, he pressed out one careful, deliberate tear and swore on his life to shelter and provide for her always. Up in the prime seats, the moneyed guests exchanged misty glances and whispered their approval, wholly taken in by the pageant before them. Not one tear from me. I held still at the back of the row, that heavy black leather folder pressed flat against my ribs. Once the vows were done, the crowd migrated smoothly into the climate-controlled reception, tents spread across the coastal grounds. The opulence inside stopped you cold. Enormous crystal chandeliers floated above the draped ceilings, pouring amber light down over tables, set with the kind of precision you only see when money is no object. White tuxedoed waiters swept through the space in a continuous loop, balancing silver trays stacked with vintage champagne and rare delicacies. My table, a dim, undersized thing, jammed into the farthest corner of the tent, sat flush against the kitchen's swinging service doors. Claudia had engineered my placement personally, burying me, somewhere her circle of luminaries would never think to glance. What she hadn't considered was that it gave me a clean, unobstructed view of everything about to collapse. As the lavish night wore on, Drake began coming apart at the seams undone by his own soaring arrogance. Flute after flute of top-shelf vintage champagne disappeared down his throat, each glass reinforcing his certainty that every crooked scheme he'd set in motion was now locked and bulletproof. He owned that dance floor, strutting among his groomsmen, landing slaps on backs, firing off blustering punchlines. He was convinced he'd swept the board. The $4 million he'd needed to keep a violent criminal syndicate off his back secured. A stunning wife locked in, her enormous generational fortune now legally within reach. Nothing could touch him, or so he believed. The dinner plates were cleared away, and a ripple of silver spoons tapping crystal signaled it was time for toasts. Drake snatched the wireless microphone from the bandleader and strode with theatrical confidence to the dead center of the polished marble floor. His speech opened with velvet pleasantries, crowd-tested stories, a performance of self-deprecation, so practiced it almost passed for genuine. He lavished praise on Claudia, crediting her taste and her backing, without once acknowledging that every cent fueling his life had been stolen from the woman standing 10 feet away. Then he faced Sloane and launched into a treacly monologue about how completely she had taken hold of his heart. The room rewarded him with warm applause, but Drake wasn't built to stop at warmth. Expensive liquor hummed through his bloodstream, and his ego had long since swallowed him whole. He craved something absolute. As the clapping thinned and died away, those cold, calculating eyes began making a slow circuit of the tent, combing the crowd. I already knew the target. His gaze rolled past the bright, gleaming tables at the front, pressed through the low shadows at the rear, and locked onto me in my corner. Every trace of the polished, charming smile dropped from his face, at once replaced by something ugly, a contemptuous, mean-spirited curl of the lip. The microphone gave a faint crackle in his fist. He'd made a decision the night wouldn't feel complete until he'd ground the man he considered worthless into the floor in front of everyone. Drake pivoted and waved the catering staff forward. They wheeled out a towering 5-tier masterpiece covered in ivory fondant and hand-painted magnolia blossoms, rolling it to the center of the dance floor, to a ripple of awed murmuring from the guests. He reached for the large, ornate silver cake knife resting on the table. He never gestured for Sloane to come stand beside him. What he did instead was hack out an obscenely large wedge of vanilla cake and muscle it onto a small porcelain plate. He passed the knife off to a waiter, who barely had time to look surprised. Cake in his right hand, microphone reclaimed in his left. Drake abandoned the cake table and set a deliberate course across the length of the crowded ballroom, aimed squarely at my dark corner. The chatter inside the tent evaporated. Guest after guest fell quiet, trading uneasy, baffled looks as the groom cut a hard line past their chairs. His pricey leather soles struck the wooden floor in sharp, measured beats. Near the middle of the room, Sloane had gone rigid, her smile dissolving, as she tracked her new husband's path toward the back of the tent. Claudia watched from where she stood, a thin, knowing smile spreading across her face. She had been waiting for exactly this. Drake reached my table. He pulled up within arm's reach, chest-pumping eyes lit with a pure, corrosive hatred. I stayed in my seat. I didn't blink. I kept my hands loose on my thighs and gave him nothing, just a wall of absolute quiet. He brought the microphone up, and his voice rolled out through every speaker in the tent, loud enough that no one present could pretend not to hear. "I'll tell you something." Drake began each word soaked in venom, dressed up as generosity. "Tonight, I find myself surrounded by exceptional people, accomplished, powerful, the kind who matter. But decency demands we also remember those life has left behind. It's only right that we extend some grace to those who never found their footing." He didn't finish the sentiment out loud. Before I had time to read his next move, he dropped the microphone on the table. He seized the thick wedge of frosting-laden cake in his bare fist, closed the distance in one lunge, and drove it into my face with everything he had. The dense, sugary mass of vanilla cake and buttercream exploded across my nose and cheeks, smearing across my vision and oozing down the front of my worn suit jacket in thick ropes of cream. "Enjoy your dessert, beggar," Drake bellowed, his voice cracking with a wild, savage pleasure. "Nobody's going to accuse me of letting my sorry excuse for a father-in-law go hungry at my own wedding." The violence of it, the sheer naked cruelty detonated through the reception tent like a thunderclap. One heartbeat of absolute silence. Then Drake's groomsmen blew the lid off with a roar of cruel, braying laughter that ricocheted off every wall. The ugliness spread outward through the crowd in a wave. Claudia hadn't moved from her spot near the front, and her smirk had opened into something close to elation. My daughter made no sound at all, both hands locked over her mouth, face ash-white with horror. I sat without moving, working the frosting clear of my eyes with slow, deliberate strokes. The cold cream tracked down and soaked into the collar of my shirt, wrecking the fabric. I didn't recoil. I didn't touch the rest of it. I held Drake's gaze and said nothing, utterly still, every nerve coiled and ready the moment I'd been building toward finally within reach. The cake continued its slow slide down my cheek and dropped softly onto the white tablecloth. Sugar clung to my lashes. Frosting pulled at the collar of my cheap jacket. I left all of it untouched. I simply sat there radiating a stillness so dense and complete it seemed to pull the warmth straight out of the tent. Drake loomed over me, shoulders back, chin up, drunk on the spectacle his groomsmen were making of my humiliation. He flung his arms open to the room, feeding on the cruel adulation washing over him. Claudia rested against a nearby table, her eyes bright and hungry as she savored the sight of the broke mechanic being shown his place. On the dance floor, my daughter hadn't moved a muscle. Sloane looked like someone had yanked the floor out from under her mid-step. She stood there stunned, unable to process the viciousness her husband had just put on display for a room full of witnesses less than 24 hours into their marriage. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. Drake turned away from me, lifting both hands to milk another round of applause from the crowd, feeding his starving ego one last time. That's when it happened. A chair wrenched violently back from a table somewhere near the front, its legs screaming across the marble floor, the sound cracking through the dying laughter like a rifle shot. From a prime VIP table close to the stage, an enormous figure rose to his feet. Doyle Hartwell. Doyle was the real thing, a genuinely ruthless billionaire who had built a real estate empire through sheer relentless force of will. Among developers along the entire eastern seaboard, few names carried more weight or commanded more fear. Drake had obviously positioned him at the wedding like a trophy, a calculated prop designed to borrow credibility from a man who had actually earned his. Doyle was not entertained. His face had gone a deep, furious crimson. He snapped his linen napkin down onto his plate and set a direct course across the polished dance floor. You felt him before you saw him clearly, the kind of physical presence that made a room rearrange itself around him. He was a big, imposing man, with no patience whatsoever for nonsense. Every last murmur in the tent died on the spot. The wedding band picked up on the sudden, dangerous shift in atmosphere and simply stopped playing. The quiet that descended over the reception was thick and smothering. Drake swiveled around, a half-confident, half-puzzled grin spreading across his face as he watched the billionaire close in. He clearly had it backwards. He assumed Doyle was crossing the room to congratulate him, to share in the joke at the poor bride's father's expense. Drake even moved to meet him, halfway hand outstretched, reaching for a handshake that said, "We're on the same team." "Have you completely lost your mind?" Doyle thundered, brushing past Drake's hand and swatting it aside like something unclean. The force of his voice rattled the crystal overhead. His eyes blazed with a volatile mixture of shock and deep, scorching outrage. A thick finger jabbed toward Drake's chest, trembling with the effort of restrained fury. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You arrogant, stupid child." Drake lurched back, his grin fracturing apart. Being dressed down this savagely by a man he practically worshipped rocked him physically. He actually staggered. "Doyle, I don't follow," Drake stammered, his voice dropping 2 full octaves into something thin and desperate. "It was nothing. A joke. He's just a mechanic." "A mechanic?" Doyle let the word hang there, his voice drenched in disbelief and contempt. He advanced another step, crowding Drake back against my small table. "You might be the most willfully blind, fraudulent fool I have run across in my entire career. That man sitting right behind you is Garrett Weston. He holds the deeds to the commercial shipping ports you've been claiming to run imports through. He controls the global logistics network that moves half the cargo on this coastline. And that major commercial high-rise in Charlotte you spent the entire cocktail hour boasting about closing on, he's the one who purchased it outright for cash yesterday morning." The gasp that tore through the reception tent was enormous. 200 wealthy investors, socialites and family members sucked in breath at the same instant, a wave of pure, undiluted shock. Those words hung suspended in the air and methodically dismantled every fiction Drake Fontaine had ever constructed. The revelation landed on the room like a demolition charge. Claudia's crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers and detonated against the marble below, but she didn't so much as blink at the sound. Her jaw had gone slack, the color leaching from her face into something pallid and sick, her eyes lurching frantically between Doyle and me. My hands stayed exactly where they were, resting loosely on the table. I reached for a folded white linen napkin with measured calm. Moving with slow, deliberate certainty, I began clearing the sugary vanilla frosting from my face, working across my eyes, my cheeks, my chin, letting every unhurried stroke underscore what Doyle's words were doing to the groom. Drake looked like something vital had been yanked out of him without warning. All the blood had evacuated his face, leaving behind the hollow, waxy look of a man in freefall. Those squared, arrogant shoulders caved inward. His breath came in short, unsteady pulls. The man who had shoved cake into my face 60 seconds ago was now visibly disintegrating in front of 200 witnesses. He turned his head toward me slowly. The smug, bulletproof hedge fund operator was simply gone. What remained was a terrified, exposed boy who had just grasped the full scope of the catastrophe he'd walked into. His eyes traveled down to the worn budget suit I had on, and in that moment, the depth of my deception landed on him all at once. I hadn't shown up to this wedding as a broken, defeated man with nothing left. I had worn the disguise of prey, carefully laid the trap, and he had charged straight through the door and bolted it shut behind himself. Sloane took 2 unsteady steps forward, confusion and dawning dread pulling at her face. "Dad," she said barely above a whisper, the word trembling in the hushed room. "Is that true? Are you Garrett Weston?" I set the stained napkin down on the table with care. I did not look at my daughter yet. Every ounce of my attention remained fixed on the sweating, shaking man standing in front of me. I pushed the chair back, the legs dragging loud and deliberate across the floor, and rose to my full height. Straightening up out of the slumped posture I'd been carrying all night changed something in the room immediately. I squared my shoulders and looked down at Drake. "Doyle has it exactly right," I said, barely raising my voice above a murmur. The quiet authority behind those few words pressed down on the room like added weight. Drake stumbled back a step, his legs nearly folding beneath him under the crushing reality of his own catastrophic miscalculation. His mouth worked, hunting for another lie to throw up, but there was no cover left anywhere. The grand, lavishly constructed illusion had finally come apart completely. I moved away from the table with calm, unhurried steps, leaving the smeared cake where it sat ready to land the finishing blow. I kept my gaze locked on him, letting the dense silence of the room do its work, letting Drake Fontaine feel the full, suffocating weight of what he'd brought down on himself. He had counted on me flinching. He had expected me to retreat into the shadows with frosting still dripping from my collar. Instead, I lifted a fresh linen napkin from the edge of the table. With slow, methodical composure, I finished clearing the last of the sticky vanilla cake from my face. Then, I let the soiled napkin drop, watching it fall and land directly at the toes of his expensive shoes. The murmuring had gone completely silent. Doyle Hartwell stood a few paces off, arms folded across his chest, watching the scene with the grim satisfaction of a man who had seen frauds unmasked before. Claudia looked on the verge of going down, both manicured hands white-knuckled around the back of a chair for support. I closed the remaining distance between myself and the man who believed he had conquered my family. The fiction of the ignorant, uneducated mechanic dissolved completely. I stood at full height, shoulders back, projecting the cold, seasoned authority of someone who runs an operation that spans the globe. Drake instinctively lurched a half-step backward, chest heaving, the full magnitude of his mistake finally registering behind his eyes. My hand moved to the breast pocket of my ruined, damp suit jacket. My fingers found the thick, heavy black leather folder that Conrad had placed in my hands in that alleyway only hours before. I drew it out slowly, tilting it just enough to let the silver crest of Weston Enterprises catch the chandelier light above us. Drake's eyes fixed on the folder and didn't move. He recognized immediately what kind of paperwork warranted that level of protection. Without dropping his gaze, I raised the folder and sent it straight at his chest, the hard binding connected squarely with his sternum. He grabbed for it, but his hands were shaking far too badly to hold on. It struck the marble floor and burst open on impact, sending a thick cascade of confidential legal documents, bank records, and printed background checks fanning out across the polished surface in every direction. Every piece of documented evidence from his fraudulent existence spread wide open for the entire room to see. "That exclusive high-powered hedge fund of yours is a ghost, Drake," I said, my voice carrying cleanly through the silence. "There are no Charlotte acquisitions. There are no international corporate mergers. Your entire operation amounts to a legally registered limited liability company with exactly 0 assets, 0 legitimate clients, and absolutely no trading history. You have been surviving on a fabricated portfolio, waving counterfeit bank statements at desperate investors and gullible socialites who were too dazzled by your rented wardrobe to bother checking your actual net worth." The guests nearest the front began turning to one another, voices dropping low and urgent. Several men, the ones who had almost certainly handed him money, went ashen on the spot and reached immediately for their phones. Drake's mouth fell open as he scrambled for some version of a response, but his throat had seized entirely. His eyes dropped to the papers scattered across the floor, and the reality crashed over him. Every careful lie he had maintained for 5 years was sitting right there in print for the world to read. I pulled my attention from the trembling wreck in front of me and found my daughter. Sloane stood motionless at the edge of the dance floor, tears gathering along her lashes. Both hands were still pressed tight against her mouth. "Sloane," I said, letting my voice go soft, aimed only at her. "I need you to take that engagement ring off right now, sweetheart." Her hands dropped slowly. She looked down at the oversized, glittering stone on her finger. I kept pushing the truth out into the open. That stone is Glass Sloane, a worthless piece of polished cubic zirconia. 3 months ago, the exact same week he got down on one knee, the man standing across from you walked into a back alley pawnbroker on Jewelers Row. He pried the flawless heirloom diamond your late grandmother had entrusted to him right out of its antique platinum setting. He sold your family's legacy for fast, desperate cash, just enough to cover the deposit on this very venue. Sloane let out a sharp, devastated gasp. The ring came off her finger as though it had scorched her. She held the fake stone up and stared at it, the full weight of the betrayal flooding across her face. Her eyes lifted to Drake, silently pleading with him to deny it, to offer her any version of an explanation. But Drake couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. He stood there staring at the floor, his jaw working in silence, confirming without a word every last thing I had just said. Claudia let out a loud, theatrical wail. The reality finally penetrating her grand social ascent had been built entirely on cheap glass and stolen heirlooms. She collapsed into the nearest chair and buried her face in her hands. The entire room stood transfixed in collective horror as the polished, charming groom was systematically stripped down and exposed a thieving, parasitic fraud who had preyed on the genuine trust of a young woman. I brought my gaze back to Drake. The moment for the final blow had arrived. I stepped forward, slow and deliberate, moving into his space, making him look up at me. He had nowhere to go, my presence on one side, the wall of stunned guests on the other. The ring was just the beginning. I said, my voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that carried every bit of its lethal weight. You borrowed exactly $4 million from an extraordinarily violent syndicate with deep ties to the Russian mob. You were desperate and you were a coward. So rather than put your own name on the line, you committed cold-blooded identity theft. You took my daughter's confidential social security number and used it as the primary collateral on your illegal marker. You signed a legal authorization allowing a cartel to strip her generational trust fund bare the moment you inevitably defaulted. Drake squeezed his eyes shut. One tear of raw, helpless fear cut down his pale cheek. His whole frame was shaking. He understood better than anyone in that room what those particular lenders did to people who couldn't pay. But that desperate game of yours is finished tonight. I kept going, each word landing like a separate strike. As of 6 this morning, my corporation moved aggressively through the shadow market. We acquired that entire debt portfolio through a network of untraceable holding companies. You don't owe the Russian mob a single cent anymore, Drake. You owe me. Your whole miserable operation belongs to me now. I hold your $4 million marker outright, and I'm calling it ineffective this moment. You have exactly 10 seconds to absorb that before my security team removes you from this reception and hands you directly to federal authorities on charges of financial fraud and felony identity theft. Run if you want, crawl out of here like the coward you are. But get out of my sight, Drake, and stay away from my family. Drake didn't run. His legs simply gave out, folding under the full crushing weight of his total annihilation. He went down onto the cold marble of the dance floor, his expensive tailored trousers crumpling awkwardly at the knees. The arrogant, untouchable groom who had shoved cake into my face minutes earlier had ceased to exist. What remained was something broken and sniveling. He crawled forward across the polished stone, closing the short distance between us. Those hands, still faintly sticky with the vanilla frosting he'd used to humiliate me, reached out and found the scuffed leather of my steel-toed work boots. He clutched them like they were the only solid thing left in his world. Tears ran freely down his face, threading through the sweat of pure panic. "Please, Mr. Weston." Drake begged, his voice climbing into a thin, pathetic whine that rang out horribly through the silent tent. "I am begging you. I will do anything. I will work for you every day for the rest of my life. I will be whatever you need me to be. Just please don't destroy me. Don't let them take me. I can make this right. I swear I can fix everything." I looked down at him, clinging to my boots. There wasn't a trace of pity anywhere inside me, only a slow, deep revulsion. This was the predator who had manipulated my daughter, sold her grandmother's irreplaceable heirloom to a pawn shop, and casually pledged her financial future to a violent criminal organization to bankroll his own hollow fantasy. I pulled my boot back with deliberate slowness, letting his grasping hands slide off the worn leather. I put a single step between us, between my family and the wreckage of his existence. You cannot rebuild anything on a foundation made entirely of lies, Drake. My voice was flat, stripped of everything but certainty. You made every one of these choices from a place of pure arrogance, completely certain you were the sharpest mind in the room. Now, every one of those choices comes back to you. I raised my right hand. No shouting required. I simply snapped my fingers. The crisp, sharp sound split the silence in the tent like a branch snapping underfoot. At once, the heavy entrance doors at the far end of the reception hall swung open. Afternoon light poured through the gap, throwing 5 advancing figures into silhouette as they came down the center aisle. Conrad led them. He wore his impeccably tailored dark charcoal suit, his expression a mask of total, unshakable authority. 2 federal agents flanked him on either side, 4 in total, dark tactical jackets, badges clipped prominently at the hip. The crowd of elite guests peeled back on instinct, retreating toward their flower-strewn tables to open up the aisle. The sight of federal law enforcement entering a billionaire's wedding reception sent a ripple of frightened murmuring through the room. Conrad halted exactly 2 feet from where Drake was still kneeling on the marble. He regarded the ruined groom with quiet disdain before shifting his full, respectful attention to me. "All warrants are in hand," Sir Conrad announced, passing a thick sheaf of official court documents to the lead agent. "The offshore transfers are frozen, and the identity theft charges have been formally filed with the federal prosecutor." I gave Conrad one firm, measured nod. "Arrest him, aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, financial conspiracy." The command left my mouth with the quiet finality of a verdict already rendered. Both lead agents moved without hesitation. They seized Drake by his expensive suit jacket and hauled him off the floor. Drake thrashed hard, panic overcoming whatever was left of his composure. "No, wait! You cannot do this to me!" He screamed, voice shattering, as the steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a sound that carried across the entire tent. "Sloan, tell your father to stop this." But Sloan simply turned away, wrapping both arms around herself as silent tears of deep betrayal tracked down her cheeks. The agents didn't pause. They spun Drake around and marched him hard down the long center aisle. He kicked and wailed, his expensive leather shoes scrabbling uselessly against the polished marble beneath him. His screams, frantic and humiliated, echoed through the floral arrangements, and the chandelier lit the perfect, pathetic score for the total collapse of everything he had constructed. The crowd watched without a word, barely breathing, as the groom was dragged out of his own wedding and loaded forcibly into the back of a federal transport vehicle waiting outside. The moment those heavy doors shut behind the agents, a different kind of energy crackled to life near the front tables. Claudia had clawed her way back from the initial shock that had paralyzed her. She had just watched the man who was meant to deliver her into elite society get frog-marched out like a common criminal. Her calculating mind worked fast, reordering everything in real time. Within seconds, she understood the poor, uneducated mechanic she had spent the entire weekend ridiculing and dismissing was in fact a titan of industry whose net worth left her most extravagant ambitions looking modest. She smoothed her expensive silk dress with both hands and arranged a sickeningly warm, entirely manufactured smile across her pale face. She came across the dance floor at nearly a run, heels striking the marble in sharp, rapid beats, making a beeline straight for me. "Garrett, darling!" Claudia breathed, her voice wobbling through a grotesque imitation of warmth. "Goodness, this is all so much to take in. Why didn't you tell us who you actually were? We could have done so much more for you. We could have given you a reception worthy of your standing. We are family after all." I looked directly into her wide, busy eyes and saw exactly what was moving behind them, naked greed treading water, just below the surface of that pitiful smile. She wasn't thinking about what her daughter had just survived. She wasn't troubled in the slightest by the criminal scheme that had nearly gutted our family. The only thing her mind was turning over was the enormous fortune she had abruptly convinced herself she could tap into. I didn't return the smile. I let the cold, hard truth of the moment settle between us like a wall. "You have never understood what family actually means, Claudia," I said, my voice going low and firm, stripping the artificial warmth right off her face. "I gave you exactly what you wanted, I played the role you cast me in because it was the only path to getting the truth out in the open. I held her gaze and let my contempt speak plainly. Because you are only drawn to a bank balance, Claudia. You have never loved a man for what he is. Not once. Not ever. I turned away from her stunned, ashen face, stepped around the wreckage of the wedding cake, and crossed the dance floor to reach my daughter. The vast reception tent, which moments earlier had hummed with the charged energy of 200 well-heeled guests, was draining fast. The socialites and opportunistic investors were evacuating the scandal as quickly as dignity allowed, exchanging low, urgent murmurs as they put distance between themselves and the wreckage of Drake Fontaine. Waiters in white tuxedo shirts quietly retreated through the kitchen doors, setting down their trays of champagne and untouched appetizers. Claudia, grasping that her elaborate social performance had been reduced to rubble, snatched up her designer handbag and made for the valet at something close to a sprint. She didn't spare a glance at her own daughter on the way out. Within minutes, the once spectacular venue stood completely hollow. The jazz trio had packed up and gone. All that remained was the soft drag of coastal wind against the heavy canvas walls of the tent and the quiet, rhythmic sound of someone crying. I crossed the empty marble floor, my steel-toed work boots producing a low, lonely echo in all that space. The great chandelier above still poured its amber light down over the ruins of the reception. Sloane was alone at a large dining table, her white wedding gown pooled out around her across the floor, a stark, painful contrast to everything written on her face. Her tears weren't for Drake. She was a sharp, clear-eyed young woman, and the brutality of what he'd done had already burned through whatever hold he'd had on her. What was breaking her was shame. She had watched him drive cake into my face. She had watched her mother tear me apart all weekend. She had been completely blind to the predator right beside her, and she had let the person who loved her most be treated like he was nothing. I pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. The vanilla frosting still staining my suit didn't concern me. My ruined collar didn't concern me. I just sat with my daughter and waited for her to find her words. She lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were swollen and red, carrying a grief so heavy it pressed against my chest. She looked at me, truly looked past the cheap clothes and the worn hands in a way she hadn't managed in years. "Dad," she said, her voice barely holding together. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was so completely blind. I let them treat you like you were nothing at all. I got so wrapped up in the fantasy, the gowns, the venues, all of it, that I couldn't see what he really was. I failed to protect you. I should have stood up for you." I didn't lecture her. I had tried gently to raise my doubts about Drake and his surface-level charm more times than I could count. The events of this evening had delivered a lesson far harder than anything I could have offered. Instead, I reached out and drew her into a long, close embrace. She pressed her face against my shoulder and let herself cry, and I held on tight. I rested my chin on her hair, being for her exactly what she needed, something solid and immovable. "I never kept my money hidden to hurt you, Sloane," I said quietly, no anger anywhere in my voice. "I hid it because I wanted to protect you from men precisely like him." When people know about serious wealth, it changes how they see you. They stop looking at a smart, beautiful woman and start looking at an unlocked door. They construct an entire version of themselves just to get inside. I wanted you to build real connections, not be hunted for what you stood to inherit. I wanted someone to love you for who you are, not for your trust fund. Drake was a predator, and predators are extraordinarily good at wearing the right disguise. You weren't foolish, sweetheart. You were trusting, and he turned that trust into a weapon. Sloane eased back from my arms, dragging her fingers across her wet cheeks. She looked down at her bare ring finger, then reached into the small silk clutch sitting on the table beside her. She drew out the oversized, sparkling engagement ring Drake had slid onto her hand, along with all his hollow promises. She studied the polished glass stone for a moment, her expression settling into something like quiet revulsion. Then she placed it in the center of my open palm. "Take it," she said, and her voice had found a new steadiness beneath the grief. "I don't want to see it again. Ever." I folded my fingers around the worthless piece of glass and put it in my pocket. I got to my feet and held out my hand. "It's time to go home, Sloane," I said. "The illusion is done. Time to walk back into the real world." She took my hand, gathered the heavy skirts of her designer gown, and stood. We moved away from the empty teals, the shattered crystal, and the abandoned cake together, walking out of the Grand Hollow stage set Drake had built with forged signatures and stolen funds. Outside, the coastal sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep amber and violet. The manicured grounds were completely deserted. We passed the empty valet stand and made our way to the rear service lot. My old rusted 2003 Chevy Silverado sat right where I'd left it that morning. It looked wildly mismatched against the grand stone estate behind it, but standing there in that moment, it looked exactly right to me. I pulled open the passenger door. The hinges gave their familiar loud protest in the still evening air. Sloane climbed in her expensive wedding gown, billowing against the cracked vinyl seat. I shut her door, walked around the front, and got behind the wheel. I pushed the key in and turned it. The old V8 caught and thundered to life, a deep shaking rumble that moved through the whole frame of the truck. Out there in that empty lot, with no one left to perform, for that rough, unapologetic roar, sounded like exactly what it was, a victory. We rolled out through the service entrance and onto the coastal highway, leaving the fraud, the deception, and the hollow world Claudia and Drake had occupied far behind. The months that came after that catastrophic wedding day were a season of real necessary healing for Sloane. We spent long stretches of time together, mornings on my porch with coffee no agenda, just rebuilding what had been chipped away between us, free of Drake's poison and Claudia's relentless vanity. Sloane gradually found her way back to herself. She came to work alongside me at Weston Enterprises, learning how our global operations actually functioned, starting from the foundation up. She came to understand that real success had nothing to do with borrowed sports cars or fake diamonds. It was built through patient effort, genuine integrity, and honest work. She put proper legal protections around her trust fund, making certain she could never again be left exposed to someone with Drake's intentions. As for Drake Fontaine, the federal system took him apart piece by piece. The evidence we had assembled left no room for argument. He went before the court on multiple federal counts, massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. The violent syndicate he had turned to for money also came under heavy scrutiny, triggering a sweeping crackdown on their entire illegal lending operation. Drake was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. No designer suits waiting for him there. No expensive champagne. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I want you to know that means something to me. This was not an easy story to carry. What I went through to protect Sloane cost me years of silence, years of being looked past and looked down on. But I believe God places us in exactly the seasons we need, even when those seasons feel like punishment. The humiliation I endured at that reception table, the cake, the laughter, the cruelty, none of it broke me. It positioned me. Every quiet year I spent building something real, while others built with smoke and mirrors, was preparing me for one specific moment. And when that moment arrived, I was ready. If this story moved you, I want to leave you with a few things worth holding on to. Never let someone's contempt for you make you reveal your hand too soon. Patience is a strategy. If someone only notices your worth once they discover your wealth, they never saw you at all. Walk away from that table. Protect the people you love, not just with words, but with preparation. Love without a plan leaves the ones you care about exposed. And if you ever find yourself being underestimated, good. Let them keep thinking that. This is the kind of family revenge story that I think speaks to something deep, especially for those of us who have spent decades watching the wrong people get rewarded. For anyone in the adults 50-plus season of life who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated as less than this one was for you. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave me a comment telling me what hit you hardest. I read them. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.